The morning of April 19th, 1944, a U-boat slides down the slipways at the Schickau shipyard in Danzig, its hull painted in the fresh grey of the Kriegsmarine. German officers gather to watch U-35-01 enter the Baltic, the first of a new type that would change everything. They call it the Elektroboot, the electric boat, and it represents something unprecedented in German naval history. Not the boat itself, revolutionary as it is, but how it came to be. This vessel was not built the traditional way, plate by plate over months of careful craftsmanship. It was assembled in sections, prefabricated in factories scattered across occupied Europe, then brought together and welded into a complete submarine in a matter of weeks. The Germans had studied American methods. They had watched as Liberty ships poured from shipyards across the Atlantic at speeds that defied everything Berlin knew about maritime construction. And now, finally, they were ready to fight, fire with fire, to turn American industrial techniques against the very nation that had perfected them, or so they believed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. What the officers watching U-35-01 could not know as champagne bottles broke against steel, was that this boat would never fire a shot in anger, that the revolutionary production system behind it would deliver not thousands of war-winning submarines, but a handful of flawed vessels plagued by defects. That while America had built 2,700 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945, Germany's attempt to mass-produce submarines would yield just 118 Type XXIs, with only a fraction fit for combat before the Reich collapsed. The irony was profound. The nation that had mocked American shipbuilding methods as crude and unsophisticated would try to copy them in desperation, and in copying them, Germany would discover that mass production was not simply a matter of blueprints and assembly lines. It was a test of industrial capacity, resource availability, and organizational culture. A test that Nazi Germany, for all its engineering prowess and military ambition, was destined to fail. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not with German ambition, but with German arrogance. In the early months of the war, when Liberty ships first appeared in intelligence reports and reconnaissance photographs, Kriegsmarine officers reacted with barely concealed contempt. The designs looked primitive, almost comically simple compared to the elegant vessels that German yards had produced for generations. Box-like hulls, ungainly superstructures, and a complete absence of the aesthetic, refinement that German naval architecture prized. These were not ships, the officers said. They were floating warehouses, ugly ducklings that would break apart in heavy seas. The dismissal was not entirely without basis. Germany had entered the war with one of the most respected shipbuilding traditions in Europe. Its engineers had designed some of the most technologically sophisticated warships afloat. The Bismarck, though ultimately doomed, represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. The U-boats that prowled the Atlantic were marvels of precision manufacturing, each one requiring months of careful assembly by skilled craftsmen. To German eyes, the idea that the United States could suddenly produce ocean-going vessels on an assembly line seemed absurd. Ships were not automobiles. They could not be stamped out like machine parts. Yet beneath the mockery lay an uncomfortable truth that some German strategists recognized even in 1941. The war at sea was fundamentally a war of arithmetic. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, understood this better than most. His submarines were sinking Allied merchant vessels at an impressive rate in the early years of the conflict. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sent millions of tons of shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. But Dönitz also knew that victory depended on sinking ships faster than the Allies could replace them. If the enemy could build new vessels faster than torpedoes could destroy them, then Germany would lose the tonnage war regardless of how many successful attacks the U-boats conducted. The first Liberty ships, launched in late 1941, appeared to vindicate German skepticism. Reports filtered back to Berlin of hull cracks, welding failures, and structural problems. German propaganda seized on these early defects, broadcasting assurances to the German public that American shipbuilding was an amateur effort doomed to failure. But by mid-1942, the intelligence coming from the Atlantic told a different story. The Americans were not just building Liberty ships, they were building them in staggering numbers. What had taken 230 days to construct in 1941 now took less than 70 days. New shipyards were springing up along the American coast, entire facilities built from empty ground in a matter of months. And the workers staffing these yards were not master craftsmen trained over decades, but ordinary civilians taught basic welding techniques in a matter of weeks. The implications were terrifying. Germany's entire naval strategy rested on the assumption that submarine warfare could strangle Britain by destroying its supply lines faster than they could be rebuilt. But if America could launch 3 Liberty ships every 2 days, then the calculus changed entirely. No number of U-boats could sink vessels that quickly. The mathematics of industrial production now favoured the Allies, and Germany faced a choice: continue building submarines the traditional way, one at a time through careful craftsmanship, and watch as American cargo capacity overwhelmed German torpedoes, or attempt something unprecedented in German naval history: abandon tradition, embrace mass production, build submarines the American way. The man who would attempt this transformation was not a naval officer, but an architect of Germany's war economy. Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production in February 1942, had already demonstrated a talent for reorganizing German industry. He had streamlined tank production, rationalized aircraft manufacturing, and centralized control over war production in ways that dramatically increased output. When Dönitz approached him in mid-1943 with a proposal for a revolutionary new submarine, Speer saw an opportunity to apply the same principles to naval construction. The submarine in question was the Type XXI, a design that represented a fundamental departure from conventional U-boat architecture. Unlike earlier submarines, which were essentially surface vessels that could submerge temporarily to attack or evade, the Type XXI was designed to operate primarily underwater. It featured a streamlined hull, enormous battery capacity, and advanced systems that would allow it to remain submerged for days at a time. In theory, these submarines would be nearly immune to Allied anti-submarine tactics, which relied on detecting U-boats on the surface or forcing them to surface through depth charge attacks. But the revolutionary nature of the design extended beyond its capabilities. The Type XXI would be built using prefabrication and modular assembly, the same techniques that Kaiser had pioneered with Liberty ships. The submarine would be divided into 8 major sections, each constructed separately at different factories, then transported to assembly yards where they would be welded together. This would allow parallel production on a massive scale. While one section was being built at a factory in Hamburg, another could be manufactured simultaneously in Bremen, and yet another in occupied Czechoslovakia. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. Final assembly would take place in 3 major shipyards, and the submarines would be completed at a rate unimaginable in traditional German naval construction. 30 boats per month, Speer promised. 1,500 submarines total by war's end. It was, on paper, exactly what Germany needed. A way to overcome the tonnage arithmetic that threatened to doom the U-boat campaign. A technological wonder weapon combined with American-style mass production. The Elektroboot would swarm into the Atlantic in such numbers that Allied convoys would be helpless against them. Britain would be strangled. America's supply lines would collapse. The tide of the war would turn. But the plan rested on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. Germany was not America. It did not have America's industrial capacity, its resource abundance, or its freedom from strategic bombing, and the attempt to copy American methods would expose every weakness in the German war economy, every flaw in Nazi industrial organization, and every cost of fighting a war on multiple fronts with dwindling resources. The first challenge emerged immediately when planning began in the summer of 1943. Traditional German submarine construction followed a methodical process refined over decades. Each U-boat was built in its entirety at a single shipyard, with components manufactured on-site or delivered from nearby suppliers. Skilled workers assembled the boat from keel to conning tower in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Quality control was rigorous. Tolerances were tight. Every weld was inspected, every system tested. The result was submarines of exceptional quality, but production was slow. A conventional Type 7 U-boat required approximately 1 year from keel laying to commissioning. The Type XXI program demanded something entirely different. Instead of building complete submarines one at a time, German industry would manufacture components across dozens of factories, then assemble them rapidly at final yards. This required a complete reorganization of the shipbuilding process. Detailed technical drawings had to be distributed to factories that had never built submarine components before. Precision specifications had to be met across multiple sites, some hundreds of miles apart. Transportation networks had to be organized to move massive steel sections, weighing up to 165 tons from inland factories to coastal assembly yards. Speer's ministry attacked these challenges with characteristic energy. Contracts were distributed to 32 different factories across Germany and occupied territories. Many of these facilities had no experience with marine construction whatsoever. They were locomotive works, bridge manufacturers, and heavy machinery plants suddenly tasked with building submarine sections to tolerances measured in millimeters. The ministry provided technical assistance, sent naval engineers to advise, and insisted that the schedule was feasible. The first sections were ordered in September 1943. The first complete submarine was promised for April 1944, but problems emerged almost immediately. The factories building submarine sections discovered that shipbuilding required a level of precision they had never encountered in their previous work. When building a bridge or a locomotive, gaps of a centimeter or more could be tolerated and filled with bolts or rivets. But submarine hulls operating at depth faced enormous pressure from surrounding water. The sections had to fit together perfectly, with near-zero tolerance, or the welds would fail catastrophically when the boat dived. Workers accustomed to rough industrial tolerances struggled to meet the exacting standards required for underwater vessels. The transportation of massive hull sections created additional complications. Each section had to be moved from its manufacturing site to the final assembly yard, and the size of these components meant they could only be transported by water. Sections built in Hamburg could be barged down the Elbe to Bremen. But sections manufactured inland, away from major waterways, posed enormous logistical challenges. Special rail cars had to be constructed to carry the weight. Routes had to be planned around bridges that could not support the load. And all of this had to occur while Allied bombers ranged increasingly freely over German territory. The assembly yards themselves required substantial modification to accommodate the new construction methods. Traditional German shipyards were designed for sequential construction, with submarines built on slipways that occupied them for months at a time. But the modular approach required different facilities. Massive cranes capable of lifting sections weighing over 100 tons had to be installed. Work areas had to be reorganized to allow multiple submarines to be assembled simultaneously. New welding equipment and techniques had to be introduced at yards where riveting had been the standard for generations. Even the steel itself became a problem. Germany had entered the war with significant steel production capacity, but by 1943, demand far exceeded supply. The Luftwaffe needed steel for aircraft. The army needed it for tanks and artillery. The construction of fortifications along the Atlantic Wall consumed vast quantities. And now Speer was demanding priority allocation for submarine construction. The competition for resources created bottlenecks throughout German industry. Steel mills could not produce enough high-quality plate. Deliveries fell behind schedule. Factories building submarine sections waited weeks for materials that should have arrived in days. The labor situation was equally dire. Germany had mobilized millions of men for military service, leaving industry desperately short of skilled workers. The gap was filled partially by slave labor, concentration camp prisoners, and prisoners of war forced to work in German factories under brutal conditions. But submarine construction required skills that could not be taught in a few days of training. Welding underwater pressure hulls demanded expertise and precision. Poor welds could doom a submarine and its entire crew. Yet the factories building Type 21s increasingly relied on workers who had never welded before, who were undernourished, overworked, and in many cases actively hostile to the German war effort. The consequences became apparent when the first hull sections arrived at the assembly yards in early 1944. Workers discovered gaps between sections that should have fitted seamlessly together. In some cases, the gaps measured 3 centimeters, over an inch. Welds that should have been smooth and perfect showed signs of poor workmanship. Some sections arrived damaged from transport, requiring extensive repair before they could be used. The quality control that had been the hallmark of German shipbuilding was breaking down under the pressure of mass production and the strains of total war. The Central Shipbuilding Committee, the organization Speer had created to oversee the program, responded with characteristic ruthlessness. Completion deadlines would not be postponed. Assembly yards were ordered to meet the schedule regardless of the condition of the sections they received. If sections arrived incomplete or damaged, the yards would finish them. If gaps existed, welders would fill them. The first submarines would be launched on time, even if that meant accepting compromises that would never have been tolerated in peacetime construction. U-3501. The submarine that launched on Hitler's birthday in April 1944 was a perfect example of these compromises. The boat was not truly ready for service. Sections had arrived late and unfinished. Assembly had been rushed to meet the symbolic deadline. Workers knew the vessel had problems. But Speer and Dönitz wanted to demonstrate progress to Hitler, wanted to show the Führer that his wonder weapon was becoming reality. As soon as Hitler's entourage departed after the ceremony, workers scrambled to bring in pontoons to keep the submarine afloat until it could be towed to a dry dock for the repairs it should have received before launch. The problems with U-3501 were not unique. As more Type 21s completed assembly through the spring and summer of 1944, each one revealed new defects. The hydraulic systems that controlled the diving planes and rudder were overly complex and prone to failure. The torpedo loading mechanism, designed to allow rapid reloading while submerged, jammed frequently. The snorkel system that allowed the boat to run its diesels while remaining at periscope depth was temperamental. The sophisticated battery system that gave the submarine its revolutionary underwater endurance sometimes short-circuited. Each boat that went through trials required weeks or months of additional work to address these problems. By autumn 1944, 32 Type 21s had been commissioned, but not one was ready for combat operations. The first 7 boats were deemed suitable only for training and experimental purposes, their defects too numerous to risk in actual combat. The submarines that followed required extensive post-construction modification. Systems had to be redesigned. Components had to be replaced. Crews had to be trained on boats that were still being fixed even as training progressed. The gap between the number of submarines technically completed and the number actually combat-ready grew wider with each passing month. Meanwhile, Allied bombers were systematically destroying the infrastructure that the Type 21 program depended on. In late 1944 and early 1945, massive air raids struck Hamburg, Bremen, Danzig, and other cities where submarines were being assembled or fitted out. Between December 31, 1944, and May 8, 1945, 17 completed Type 21s were sunk in harbour before they could even begin combat operations. 7 were destroyed in Hamburg, 6 were lost in Kiel, 4 more were sunk in Bremen. Each loss represented months of labour, tons of scarce materials, and the evaporation of Germany's hopes for a technological salvation. The bombing also disrupted the production of components. Factories that had been building hull sections or manufacturing submarine systems were damaged or destroyed. Supply chains carefully organised by Speer's ministry broke down as transportation networks collapsed under aerial attack. By early 1945, some sections were arriving at assembly yards 6 months behind schedule, if they arrived at all. The carefully planned production system was falling apart faster than German authorities could reorganize it. And all of this was happening while the military situation deteriorated on every front. The Eastern Front was collapsing as Soviet armies drove toward Berlin. The Western Allies had liberated France and were pushing into Germany itself. Training areas in the Baltic, where U-boat crews had practiced for decades, were under threat. Fuel supplies were running critically low. Experienced submariners were increasingly difficult to find as casualties mounted, and veteran crews were killed in the desperate defense of the Reich. The Type XXI program had been designed to save Germany from exactly this situation. The revolutionary submarines, produced in revolutionary numbers, were supposed to turn the tide of the war at sea. They would break the Allied supply lines. They would force Britain to negotiate. They would buy time for Germany to develop even more advanced weapons. But by the beginning of 1945, it was clear that the program had failed to deliver on its promises. Germany had attempted to copy American methods of mass production, to build submarines the way Kaiser built Liberty ships, and the attempt had exposed every weakness in the German war economy. Where America had vast resources, Germany faced critical shortages. Where American factories could operate without fear of attack, German production sites were under constant aerial bombardment. Where American shipyards drew on a workforce of millions, including women and minorities previously excluded from skilled work, Germany relied increasingly on slave labor that had neither the training nor the motivation to produce quality work. And where American industry operated under a relatively rational system of resource allocation and production priorities, German industry labored under the chaotic and competing demands of a totalitarian state at war on multiple fronts. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards had built 2,700 Liberty ships. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Type XXI program had produced 118 submarines. Of these, only 4 were considered fully combat-ready. 2 actually conducted war patrols, and neither fired a shot before Germany collapsed. It was a failure of staggering proportions, made more bitter by the fact that Germany had attempted to adopt the very methods it had once mocked as crude and unsophisticated. The psychological impact of this failure extended beyond simple military defeat. For German engineers and industrial planners who had long prided themselves on precision, quality, and technological sophistication, the collapse of the Type XXI program was a profound humiliation. They had believed that German methods were inherently superior to the rough-and-ready pragmatism of American industry. The Liberty ships might be ugly and simple, but German submarines would be elegant and advanced. Yet when Germany attempted mass production, the results were inferior to what America had achieved with far simpler vessels. The Elektroboot, supposed wonder weapons of the Reich, were mechanically unreliable, structurally flawed, and produced in numbers too small to matter. Part 2 of the script. The root of Germany's failure lay not in engineering incompetence, but in the fundamental incompatibility between mass production and the structure of the Nazi state. American mass production succeeded because it emerged from a society with certain characteristics that Germany lacked. The United States had enormous natural resources within its own borders. It had a vast industrial base operating far from any combat zone. It had a relatively rational system of economic organization that could prioritize and allocate resources according to strategic need. And perhaps most importantly, it had a culture that valued pragmatism over perfectionism, that was willing to accept good enough in pursuit of overwhelming quantity. Nazi Germany possessed none of these advantages. Its resources were limited and grew more constrained as the war progressed. Its industrial base was increasingly subject to devastating aerial bombardment. Its economic organization was characterized by competing bureaucracies, personal fiefdoms, and the chaotic decision-making of a dictatorship. And its culture remained wedded to notions of engineering excellence and technological superiority that made the compromises necessary for true mass production psychologically difficult to accept. The contrast with American Liberty ship production was stark in almost every detail. When Henry Kaiser proposed mass-producing cargo vessels using welding and prefabrication, American maritime authorities were skeptical but willing to try. When the first Liberty ships developed problems, American engineers studied the failures, modified the designs, and continued building. The ships were never perfect, but they were good enough, and they were produced in numbers that overwhelmed their deficiencies. The American approach accepted that some ships would crack, some would sink, and some would fail. But for every vessel lost, 2 more would slide down the ways to replace it. Germany could not adopt this philosophy. The Kriegsmarine had spent decades building a reputation for quality and precision. Every U-boat that left a German shipyard was expected to be a masterpiece of engineering, a vessel that would perform flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. The idea of accepting known defects, of launching submarines that would require extensive post-production repairs, violated every principle of German naval construction. Yet the Type XXI program demanded exactly these compromises. Mass production required accepting imperfection in exchange for speed and quantity. The tension between these competing values paralyzed the program. The Central Shipbuilding Committee insisted on meeting production deadlines, launching submarines according to schedule regardless of their condition. But the Kriegsmarine commanders who would send men to sea in these boats balked at accepting vessels they considered unsafe. Naval inspectors found defects and demanded corrections. Shipyard workers spent weeks fixing problems that should have been prevented during initial construction. Each submarine cycled through repeated repairs and modifications, extending the time between launch and combat readiness from the planned weeks to actual months. The resource constraints made everything worse. Steel shortages meant that even when sections were ready for assembly, the materials needed to complete them might not be available. Germany had attempted to reduce dependence on Swedish iron ore by developing domestic sources. But Hitler had failed to invest sufficient resources in the necessary mining infrastructure. The result was production bottlenecks that rippled through the entire economy. When steel was available, other critical materials might be lacking. Copper for electrical systems, rubber for seals and gaskets, specialized alloys for engine components, all were in chronic short supply by 1944. The allocation of these scarce resources became a battlefield of competing priorities. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe demanded resources for aircraft production. The army needed materials for tanks and artillery. The Atlantic wall fortifications consumed vast quantities of concrete and steel. And now the submarine program wanted priority access to everything. In theory, Hitler could have imposed a rational priority system, but the Führer's decision-making grew increasingly erratic as the war turned against Germany. He would grant priority to one program, then reverse himself weeks later after a meeting with a different official. The chaos of Nazi administration meant that even when resources were allocated to submarine production, they might be diverted elsewhere before reaching the intended factories. Labor problems compounded the material shortages. By 1944, Germany was scraping the bottom of the barrel for workers. Skilled German craftsmen were in military service or had been killed in action. The gap was filled by foreign workers, many forced into service, others nominally voluntary but working under duress. Concentration camp prisoners labored in submarine factories under conditions that virtually guaranteed poor quality work. Prisoners of war, who might have possessed valuable skills, had neither the motivation nor often the physical strength to perform precise industrial work after months or years of inadequate rations. The moral implications of this slave labor were obvious, but even setting aside the profound ethical questions, the use of coerced labor was strategically counterproductive. Workers who were starving, abused, and desperate were not capable of the precision work that submarine construction required. Sabotage was common. Some of it was deliberate, acts of resistance by prisoners who knew they were building weapons that would be used against their own countries. But much of it was simply the inevitable result of forcing people to perform skilled work under impossible conditions. A welder who was too weak from hunger to hold his torch steady would produce poor welds whether he intended to or not. The contrast with American Liberty ship workers could not have been sharper. The men and women in Kaiser's shipyards were well-fed, well-paid, and motivated by the belief that they were contributing to a just cause. They worked long hours, often in difficult conditions, but they chose to be there. The training they received was basic, but it was sufficient for the relatively simple tasks of Liberty ship construction, and when problems arose, they had the energy and initiative to solve them. German submarine workers by 1944 were exhausted, malnourished, and in many cases hostile to the entire enterprise. The wonder is not that Type 21 production failed, but that it produced anything at all. The bombing campaign administered the final blow to German hopes. The United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force had spent years perfecting the techniques of strategic bombing. By 1944, they could put hundreds of heavy bombers over German industrial targets with devastating accuracy. The submarine construction program presented particularly vulnerable targets. The assembly yards where Type 21s were built were located in major port cities, easily identified from the air. The factories producing sections were large industrial facilities that showed up clearly in reconnaissance photographs, and the transportation network that moved sections from factories to yards depended on bridges, rail yards, and canals that could be destroyed by precision bombing. The Allied air offensive struck systematically at every element of the submarine production system. Factories were bombed repeatedly until they ceased production. Rail yards were destroyed, severing the transportation links between component manufacturers and assembly sites. The ports where submarines were fitted out became fields of rubble. Some of the attacks employed massive Grand Slam bombs, 10-ton weapons designed specifically to destroy hardened targets like submarine pens. In March 1945, these earthquake bombs devastated the Valentin submarine pen near Bremen, a massive concrete bunker that was supposed to be the centerpiece of Type 21 final assembly. The destruction was not just physical but psychological. Workers who survived the bombings often refused to return to the yards. Entire workforces fled, cities that were being systematically destroyed. Factory managers reported that they had facilities and materials, but no one to operate the machinery. In the final months of the war, production collapsed not because Germany lacked the technical ability to build submarines, but because the social and industrial infrastructure necessary for any kind of manufacturing had disintegrated under aerial assault. Through all of this, German propaganda continued to promise that the Type 21 would save the Reich. Newspapers published articles about revolutionary U-boats that would turn the tide of the war. Radio broadcasts assured the German people that new wonder weapons were about to enter service. Hitler himself, increasingly detached from reality in his Berlin bunker, demanded to know when the Elektroboot would begin sinking Allied ships by the hundreds. But the gap between propaganda and reality grew wider with each passing week. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By April 1945, the truth was undeniable even to the most optimistic German planners. The Type 21 program had failed. Of the 118 submarines built, the vast majority sat incomplete or under repair. A few were operational for training purposes. Two boats, U-511 and U-3008, actually departed on combat patrols in the final days of the war. U-2511, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Adalbert Schnee, a decorated veteran of conventional U-boat operations, sailed from Kiel in mid-March. The boat made it to Norwegian waters and conducted a brief patrol before Germany's surrender on May 8. Schnee later claimed he had maneuvered into attack position against a British cruiser, but held his fire when he received the ceasefire order. Whether this story was true or a post-war embellishment is uncertain. What is certain is that U-2511 never fired a torpedo in combat. U-3008 had an even briefer operational career. The boat left port in late April, conducted a short patrol, and returned without engaging any targets. And that was the entire combat record of the Type 21 fleet. 2 patrols. 0 ships sunk, 0 torpedoes fired in anger, 118 submarines built at enormous cost, consuming resources desperately needed elsewhere, and they contributed nothing to Germany's war effort beyond a brief propaganda boost and false hope that wonder weapons might somehow change the outcome of a war already lost. The final accounting was brutal. Germany had invested vast quantities of scarce steel into the program. One senior engineer estimated that a single Type 21 consumed steel equivalent to 30 tanks. Given that 118 submarines were built, the program absorbed resources that could have produced over 3,000 tanks, weapons that might have made a real difference in the desperate defensive battles of 1944 and 1945. The labor invested in submarine construction could have been used to build aircraft, artillery, or the defenses that might have slowed the Allied advance. Instead, Germany poured resources into a program that delivered virtually nothing of military value. When the war ended in May 1945, Allied forces swept through German ports and discovered dozens of Type 21 submarines in various states of completion. Intelligence officers examined the boats with interest, recognizing immediately that the design was revolutionary. The streamlined hulls, the enormous battery capacity, the advanced systems, all represented a genuine leap forward in submarine technology. American and British naval architects understood that if Germany had succeeded in producing these boats in quantity 2 years earlier, the Battle of the Atlantic might have gone very differently. But they also recognized that the submarines they were examining were deeply flawed, mechanically unreliable, and produced using methods that had been improvised under impossible conditions. The Allies divided the captured submarines among themselves. The United States took several Type 21s back to America for detailed study. The Soviet Union received others as part of war reparations. The British examined the boats with great interest, noting both the innovative design features and the quality problems that rendered many of them unseaworthy. Over the following years, naval architects from multiple nations incorporated Type 21 design elements into their own submarines. The streamlined hull became standard in post-war submarine construction. The emphasis on underwater performance rather than surface capability influenced decades of submarine development. In this sense, the Type 21 program did have a lasting impact, though not the impact Germany had intended. But, for Germany in 1945, the captured submarines were simply evidence of failure. The attempt to adopt American mass production methods, to build submarines the way Kaiser built Liberty ships, had exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the Nazi war economy. The Reich had possessed the engineering talent to design revolutionary weapons, but it lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. It had the ambition to match American production, but not the resources. It had the determination to fight on when the war was already lost, but not the wisdom to recognize that determination alone could not overcome material reality. The broader strategic implications of the Type 21 failure were profound. Germany had bet enormous resources on the program, diverting steel, labor, and industrial capacity away from other uses. The submarines were supposed to be the weapon that would cut Allied supply lines and force a negotiated peace. When the program failed to deliver, Germany had nothing to show for the investment except a few dozen flawed boats and a propaganda narrative that even true believers found increasingly difficult to sustain. The resources consumed by the submarine program might have been better spent on conventional U-boats, which at least were proven designs that could be produced reliably if slowly. Or the resources could have been invested in air defense, which might have reduced the Allied bombing that was systematically destroying German cities and industry. But Nazi Germany was never capable of making such rational calculations. The regime was built on fantasies of technological superiority and racial destiny. Hitler and his inner circle believed that German engineering genius would produce wonder weapons that would overcome any material disadvantage. They believed that willpower and determination could substitute for resources and industrial capacity. They believed, until the very end, that some miraculous development would turn the tide of war. The Type 21 program fed these delusions, offering hope that revolutionary submarines would succeed where conventional forces had failed. The comparison to American Liberty ship production revealed how completely Germany had misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. The Liberty ships were successful not because they were technologically advanced, but because they were simple enough to be produced in overwhelming numbers. They were successful because American industry could operate without fear of attack, could draw on unlimited resources, could mobilize a workforce of millions. They were successful because the United States accepted that the ships did not need to be perfect, only adequate and numerous. Germany attempted to copy the methods without possessing the necessary conditions for success. The result was predictable. By the time Admiral Dönitz surrendered the remainder of the Kriegsmarine in May 1945, the irony of the situation was inescapable. Germany had mocked the Liberty ships as crude and unsophisticated. It had derided American welding techniques as inferior to traditional riveting. It had laughed at the idea that cargo vessels could be mass-produced like automobiles. And then, when the tonnage war turned against Germany, when U-boats could no longer sink ships faster than America could build them, Germany had attempted to adopt those same American methods. The attempt had failed spectacularly, producing a handful of flawed submarines, while America had produced thousands of functional cargo vessels. The legacy of the Type XXI program extended beyond the immediate military failure. For German engineers and industrial planners, the program became a cautionary tale about the limits of technological ambition. The submarines represented everything Germany had believed about its own superiority, the conviction that German engineering could overcome any obstacle, that revolutionary technology could substitute for industrial capacity. The failure of the program demonstrated that modern warfare was decided not by the sophistication of individual weapons systems, but by the unglamorous arithmetic of production and logistics. For the Allies, the Type XXI program provided valuable lessons about submarine design, but also about the vulnerabilities of industrial systems. The Allied bombing campaign had proven that even the most ambitious production programs could be disrupted by sustained aerial attack. The destruction of factories, transportation networks, and assembly yards had prevented Germany from realizing the full potential of its submarine design. This lesson would influence strategic thinking throughout the Cold War, as both sides recognized that industrial infrastructure was as important a target as frontline military forces. For historians analyzing the war decades later, the Type XXI program illustrated the broader pattern of German strategic failure. Germany had entered the war with significant military advantages, including a well-trained army, technological sophistication, and operational excellence. But it had fatally underestimated the importance of industrial capacity and resource availability. The United States might have been less experienced militarily at the war's outset, but it possessed industrial resources that Germany could never match. And when America applied those resources to military production, using methods that seemed crude by German standards, the results overwhelmed German attempts at technological superiority. The story of Germany's failed attempt to mass-produce submarines stands as a mirror image to the success of American Liberty ship production. Where America had built 2,700 cargo vessels that sustained Allied armies across multiple theaters, Germany had built 118 submarines, only a handful of which ever operated, and none of which affected the war's outcome. Where American workers in Kaiser's shipyards had welded together simple but functional vessels, German workers in bombed-out yards struggled to assemble complex submarines from defective components. Where American pragmatism had accepted imperfection in pursuit of quantity, German perfectionism had insisted on quality standards that could not be maintained under wartime conditions. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The mathematical reality was inescapable. If the goal had been to disrupt Allied shipping through submarine warfare, Germany would have been better served building conventional U-boats than investing in the Type XXI program. A conventional Type 7 U-boat required less steel, less labor, and less industrial infrastructure than a Type XXI. The production bottlenecks that limited Type XXI output would have allowed Germany to build perhaps 3 or 4 conventional submarines for every Elektroboot produced. These conventional boats, while less capable individually, would have been available earlier and in greater numbers. The cumulative impact of 400 conventional U-boats entering service in 1944 might have been greater than the negligible contribution of the handful of Type XXIs that actually operated. But this rational calculation never occurred because it contradicted the fundamental Nazi belief in technological superiority. Hitler and his circle were mesmerized by revolutionary weapons, by the promise of wonder weapons that would turn defeat into victory through sheer technological advancement. They could not accept that simple, proven designs might be more valuable than sophisticated new systems. They could not accept that Germany's best strategy might be to maximize production of conventional weapons rather than gambling on revolutionary developments, and they could not accept that American methods, crude and unsophisticated as they appeared, might be superior to German engineering traditions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. In the end, the Type 21 program became another example of Nazi Germany's fatal combination of technological ambition and strategic incompetence. The submarines themselves were genuine engineering achievements, innovative designs that influenced post-war submarine development worldwide. But as weapons of war, they were failures, produced too late, in too few numbers, with too many defects to affect the outcome of the conflict. The attempt to copy American mass production methods had exposed every weakness in the German war economy, from resource shortages to labor problems, to the vulnerability of industrial infrastructure to aerial bombardment. The Liberty ships, those ugly ducklings that German officers had, mocked, outlasted the Reich that scorned them. Many served for decades after the war, carrying cargo across the world's oceans. A few survive even today as museum ships, floating reminders of an industrial miracle. The Type 21 submarines mostly ended as scrap or as prizes for the victors to study. The contrast between these outcomes tells the story of two different approaches to industrial warfare and two very different results. Germany had tried to copy America's Liberty ship production methods and failed, but the failure was not primarily technical. German engineers understood the principles of prefabrication and modular assembly. They could design sections and plan production sequences. The failure was systemic, rooted in the fundamental structure of the Nazi war economy and the reality of Germany's strategic situation. A nation short on resources, under constant bombardment, fighting on multiple fronts, and led by a regime incapable of rational priority setting, could not successfully implement the mass production techniques that had succeeded in America's resource-rich, secure industrial base. The final irony is that if Germany had succeeded in producing 1,500 Type 21 submarines as Speer promised, the war might have lasted longer, but the outcome would have been the same. By late 1944, when the Elektroboot were supposed to enter service in quantity, Germany had already lost the war. The Eastern Front had collapsed. France had been liberated. Allied bombers ranged over Germany at will. No number of submarines, however revolutionary, could have changed these facts. The Type 21 program diverted resources that might have prolonged Germany's resistance by a few months, but it could not have prevented defeat. The lesson that emerged from the program's failure was clear. Modern industrial warfare was decided not by the elegance of individual weapons systems, but by the brutal mathematics of production capacity. Germany had possessed talented engineers, sophisticated designs, and ambitious plans, but it lacked the resources, the infrastructure, and the organizational capacity to turn those plans into reality on the necessary scale. America had built 2,700 Liberty ships because it possessed these things in abundance. Germany built 118 Type 21 submarines, and failed to make them combat effective because it did not. In the end, the attempt to copy the Liberty ship model of production revealed more about Germany's weaknesses than about its strengths. The Type 21 program stands as a monument to ambition without resources, to technological sophistication without industrial capacity, and to the fatal consequences of strategic delusion. The submarines were supposed to win the war. Instead, they became evidence of why Germany lost it, proof that no amount of engineering brilliance could overcome the fundamental imbalance between German resources and American industrial might. The Liberty ships had won not through elegance or sophistication, but through sheer overwhelming numbers. Germany's attempt to match those numbers with revolutionary submarines failed, and in failing, demonstrated the lesson that Nazi leaders never learned. Wars are won not by wonder weapons, but by the side that can produce more, faster, and keep producing even under the most difficult conditions. America had done exactly that. Germany could not. And that difference, more than any single battle or campaign, explains why the ugly ducklings Germany once mocked outlasted the sleek submarines Germany built to destroy them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.